Hello, welcome to the Science for Policy podcast. My name's Toby, and today I'm joined by Professor Janusz Bujnicki. Professor Bujnicki is a molecular biologist who leads a research group at the International Institute of Molecular and Cell Biology in Warsaw, where his research includes computational modelling of RNA structures and engineering proteins with new functions. He's also worked extensively with policymakers, not just in his native Poland, where he has a range of science advice roles, but also at European level, where he was previously a member of the group of chief scientific advisors to the European Commission, and he now represents Poland in the European Science Advisors Forum. So, Janusz, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Toby. Thank you very much for inviting me and for introducing me.
It's the least I can do. I think your term as a science advisor at the European Commission ended not too long after I arrived at the scientific advice mechanism, so we didn't really overlap. Do you look back fondly on your time working with the Commission? Was it time well spent?
Oh, yes. It was a great time, and for many reasons. First, it was a very enriching experience for me. First of all, I met scientists and professionals from very different areas, not just from science, but also from policymaking and many other areas that are important for policymaking. And together, we were learning how to work with policymakers, providing science advice, learning how to provide science advice for policymakers in the best way, and what is useful, what is not so useful, and how to talk to each other and to other professionals to explain science in the terms that not only we understand, but could be translated to a more broadly understandable language, which was not easy, but it was tremendous experience. I think all of us share this impression that we learned a lot, and also that it was really useful, because the feedback we got from our clients, from in the Commission, and from other colleagues working with us was that it was really useful to see this different areas of science and different ways of interpreting scientific evidence, and making opinions together as something that was very useful and different from the previous times where there was no group of scientific advisors coming from such a different areas.
Yeah, so it sounds very much like a team sport.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Right, and now your term has come to an end and you have headed home to Poland, as it were. Has there been any traffic in either direction in terms of perhaps insights from Brussels that you're now able to bring into your science advice work in Poland, or vice versa, experiences from Poland that were helpful to you in your Brussels role?
Well, of course, I tried to bring the lessons from the European Commission to Poland, but I have to admit that I have not left Brussels and the circle of scientific advisors completely, because I was asked to stay as an expert. Also, other members of the group who are no longer members, former members, are still involved in preparation of various opinions as experts, sharing not only our individual scientific expertise, but also our experience in working in the science advice system. So the European Commission is building an ecosystem of science advisors in this way. I think it is a very smart thing to do.
Okay, why do you say that?
Because it is very difficult to give science advice without all this experience, what works, what doesn't work. And it's both the institutional memory and also the personal experience that is very useful in such situations. And this is actually one of the things that I try to convey in Poland, where the scientific advice has been treated differently and given differently than in the European Commission. To some extent, some of the ideas were accommodated, but well, first of all, I don't think that the science advice mechanism as it is in the European Commission could be or should be copied exactly in its form to Poland, because its national government is a different thing than the European Commission. And obviously, the tasks of the government are not the same as the Commission, and the advice is given in a different context. And national in particular, not so much, to some extent international, but not as international as in the European Commission. And so different local contexts have to be taken more into account. And also local politics has to be taken into account. From my observations, in Poland, where I have been involved in an advisory role, but as a member of Science Policy Committee and other advisory committees advising on issues such as evaluation of research institutions and sometimes making some strategic funding decisions. This side of advice given by scientists to the government, especially in the national context, especially in Poland, is to some extent focused on balancing different interests and making sure that different groups are represented. For instance, that in a given advisory body, there is a right mix of representatives of universities, research institutes, National Academy of Sciences, and other groups. And also that the representation makes sense in the sort of geographic terms, that it covers different regions of Poland and many other levels. So this, to some extent, serves both to be able to scan the opinions from different areas, both of science and of institutional context, and in different cities, different regions in the country, and also to balance different conflicting interests. So this is actually a very important thing. In this way, it was different for the European Commission, where it would be basically impossible to have representatives of all possible varieties and their combinations. But it was in the European Commission, the focus was mostly on high-level expertise and the diversity of expertise that would come together, and then bringing additional expertise with very strong support from the Secretariat, from the unit with professionals working at the Commission who supported us in helping develop the different types of opinions and advisory documents. In the Polish system, typically the advisory bodies are given very little admin support and very little additional professional support. There's no extra analytical department that is working essentially for the advisory group. Usually the scientists would meet, discuss a given issue by themselves or with the representative of a given ministry, for instance, and then provide advice that would be averaged out on the level of the overall discussion, or making one opinion drafted by the scientists themselves. Not so much with the involvement of the additional professional support. So one of the things I was trying to convey, which is I think still not really so much developed in Poland, that one of the key elements of the recipe for success of the science advice is to have a very strong professional administrative and organizational support. So the scientists should not be left alone in their advisory role, because they need to recognize the needs of the clients and also gathering of the information. So the advice is really based on evidence and on complete evidence that can be synthesized. And I'm referring both to science for policy and policy to science advice. In both cases, this advisory role works much differently if it's based on the collection and analysis of evidence, rather than on basically balancing the opinion of different players and actors in a given area who have different views on the matter.
Right. That's interesting, because it sounded like you started by describing two different roles. So one, science for policy, about bringing scientific insights into policy, and the other one, policy for science, which is more about, as you described it, like conveying the views of different parts of the community in the hope that the policymaker then makes the right decision about governing that community, right? So it's a different kind of thing. Do you see those two areas as areas that can realistically be combined, either by the same person or at least in the same kind of structure, mechanism?
Well, I think they can be combined if the conflicts of interest are very carefully monitored. From my experience, it often doesn't work well. Some of the biggest threats are that the science advisor could have sort of self-serving advice and be more of an advocate for him or herself or a particular group of scientists rather than advising on a particular topic. So I think it could work if the scientist isn't involved in research on a particular topic where the advice is provided. And in policy for science advice, actually, in most of the cases, there is some conflict of interest. It needs to be properly balanced. But when this happens in the context of science for policy advice, I'm not sure that the conflicts of interest can be balanced. I think it's better that they are rather avoided than balanced by bringing in another conflict of interest from a different side, because this is becoming more political rather than scientific. However, one thing that I tried to convey a moment ago is that data and information play important role, not only in science for policy advice, but also in policy for science advice, making informed decisions based on data and not just on a view of the situation of a given scientist can really make a big difference. But if the two things are mixed, then the question is what is more important, and how this advice is used and played by the policymakers and politicians. Something like this actually happened to me as a member of the advisory group on preventing, counteracting, and combating COVID-19, an advisory group of the Polish Ministry of Science and Higher Education, which was established in March of 2020, and which was supposed to combine science advice on COVID-19 and on emerging situation with new data pouring in from different directions and interpreting this with evaluation of applications for funding for COVID-19 related projects, mostly in the area of applied sciences, because the ministry was essentially flooded by projects submitted by various scientists asking for sometimes very large amounts of money to fund the projects that were supposed to help with the pandemic in a very short term. So the ministry required someone to make sense out of these applications in a different way than it would be handled by a typical funding agency, because it was funded directly by the ministry, and sometimes these decisions were not only based on merit but on some political constraints. This group did a very good job in defending the ministry from some of the proposals that were not realistic. They would not make a difference probably according to our scientific evaluation. However, this group could not fulfill its role in the science advice because, as it turned out, nobody listened. The ministry was not really interested in listening to our scientific advice on the topic, and essentially the group was disbanded in September 2020 after the avalanche of funding proposals has faded away because the other research agencies took over the regular task of funding COVID-related research rather than having it with the ministry to handle the urgent calls.
So it was essentially set up to provide both advice on what to fund and also policy advice related to COVID. And in the end, the second role never really materialized.
Yes, so essentially, as it turned out, there was no channel between us as an advisory group and the center of policy making that could allow us to make any impact. So even though we were sharing information and summaries of the scientific data, they were probably getting stuck somewhere. So they never reached, I believe they were only reaching the ministry, but there was no proper mechanism to convey that advice to the prime minister, essentially, and to other key decision makers. So the ministry would receive that advice, but they could only pass it to the rest of the government through the political process rather through the scientific mechanism. So it was obvious for me from a very long time ago that what is necessary for science advice to work is to have a direct contact with the recipient of the information, which was not the case here. It eventually materialized. So the Polish government established such advisory body. They established a medical council, which was a subsidiary advisory body directly to the prime minister, Mateusz Morawiecki, which was set up in November 2020. So after our group was disbanded, and the body's main tasks were to analyze and assess both the current situation and provide opinions on legislation. So, for instance, to recommend what to do regarding new rules and restrictions. And independently of this advisory body, the Polish Academy of Sciences decided to set up its own interdisciplinary advisory team on COVID-19 in the middle of 2020. And here the advisory role was not attached directly to the prime minister, but it was more like synthesis and dissemination of scientific knowledge without many strings attached. So here the communication was through the works of that body which were published. And everybody could read them. So there's full transparency, and the government could use it. It was a free lunch they could grab whenever they wanted. The medical council, as the name suggests, was basically composed of medical experts and experts in public health, and they were providing suggestions about regulations, especially concerning the restrictions. Obviously, in Poland, like in many other countries, there were strong protests against some of the restrictions, and there was a growing divide between what the medical council recommended and what was introduced and what could be introduced by the government. So in January 2022, most members of the medical council resigned, and they cited the lack of impact of their recommendation on real government actions as one of the main reasons. And then the body was dissolved, and the new council was established in February 2022, COVID-19 Council, which now included, of course, medical and public health experts, but also experts in socioeconomic sciences and various representatives of institutions, including in particular the Minister of Health and presidents of various offices related to medicine and pharmacy, like chief sanitary inspector, chief pharmaceutical inspector, and the like. So the body has changed, and actually this was I think this is a proper direction. So if such a body was constructed in the first place, composed of experts covering very wide areas of importance for the pandemic. So not just medicine, because the pandemic is not just a medical problem, but it's also a social economic problem. So obviously expert in social sciences and economy should be there to start with, and also other experts, especially in public health. I think at that time this body could have more impact. And of course, if it was set up as a direct advisory body to the prime minister. So this path was very long. It took about 2 years to materialize, but eventually a system was created that I think fits the purpose much more than the initial ones. In parallel, this advisory team of the Polish Academy of Sciences continues to work and publishing different scientific recommendations, which everybody can see and read and comment on, while the COVID-19 Council is working more closely to the Prime Minister, and their recommendations are not announced publicly, or at least not directly.
Okay, so their advice is not public.
They are released to the public, but obviously they are formatted differently because they are targeting the Prime Minister and his direct co-workers directly, rather than Polish Academy of Sciences that targets essentially the whole spectrum of audiences, including the government, but also the general public.
Yeah, so you've got these effectively two parallel channels, one inside government and one outside.
Yes, a top-down and a bottom-up approach, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting that it took, by the sound of it, 2 false starts, basically, before this prime ministerial level thing finally made it. So do you think the same thing was going... So you described the committee that you were part of early on, that it didn't manage to reach decision makers with its science advice. And it sounds like a similar complaint was made by members of the medical council when they resigned, that they said also, basically, look, we're not having any impact here. Do you think the reason they felt that way was the same as the reason in the first case, that there was no channel for the advice they gave to reach the people it needed to reach? And then with number 3, finally, the government took the hint and set up something more effective.
Well, I think it involved mostly learning by experience. So it was probably not the government listening to recommendations how the science advice should be constructed, but learning from its own experience with scientists and with science advice. Because what is very important is, I think, that the scientists themselves had to be educated, have to give advice, because the expectations from the scientific community and perhaps maybe some of the members of these different advisory bodies were unrealistic. I believe, and actually I know from some of the comments, that some of the scientists had a view that, well, they will come and tell the government what they need to do, and the government would just do that, which is not realistic at all.
So you think it was lack of experience and maybe mismatched expectations on both sides, rather than it being anything more cynical, like the government just didn't care or the scientists didn't bother engaging or whatever?
Yes, I believe that there was a learning process on both sides, both the government and the scientists, and also getting to know each other's ways. I think that because of the previous experience in policy for science advice, where scientists were very frequently advocates for various issues and their own benefit, the government was used to this attitude of scientists, which was not so helpful when it comes to giving advice on science advice for policy making. So it probably took time for the scientists also to understand which of the recommendations are useful, and that recommendations basically give us more money to do more research. That's not really the recommendation that fits the context.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I guess it's another reason to keep the two separate, policy for science and science for policy, not just to avoid a conflict of interest on the science side, possibly, but also so that the trust can develop with the policymakers, so they don't just, roll their eyes and say, well, every time I ask my science advisor a question, they tell me to fund their new lab so they can figure out the answer.
Yes, exactly. So it's absolutely the issue of trust and also understanding of each other's ways of working. And I believe many scientists in Poland and existing bodies could serve a role in science advice if they were given a chance both to connect to the policymakers and to be placed in the proper context, and also if they were given a chance to learn how to do this. So if there was some space for making mistakes. Because this is a necessary element of learning to allow for mistakes, because it's one cannot learn without making mistakes. And here I wanted to express my opinion, and also which is shared by many other scientists I know, that institutions such as Polish Academy of Sciences could be used more by the government. So not only to have specialized advisory bodies for the purpose such as the COVID-19 pandemic, but existing bodies that already work in certain areas of science, such as the scientific committees of the Polish Academy of Sciences, many of which actually group top experts from Poland. So if they were given very clear expectations from the policymakers of where the science advice is needed, where it would be helpful, I'm sure that many of them would be happy to provide recommendations. Obviously, then in this process, there need to be filters, because scientists love to tell the government what the government should or shouldn't do. The scientists prefer doing this very frequently over actually summarizing what is known about science without making recommendations. But I think if there is some space allowed for scientists to express their opinions, what they would like to see and what they wouldn't like to see, and simply filtering out by the policymakers and keeping what is really valuable, then I think this could work. And both sides could learn how to work together, both scientists finding out what actually works when they give advice to policymakers, and the policymakers learning how to ask questions so they actually get response from the scientific community.
Yeah, that's very good. I have a couple of practical questions about how easily that might take shape. So this idea of learning on the job. So fine. So Poland hasn't had a long history of institutionally embedded science advice, as you say. So both sides need to understand what the job involves, what the expectations are, I guess what kind of input is and isn't helpful, that kind of thing. But this idea of learning on the job, politically speaking, might be quite challenging. To ask a government to come to, say, the Polish Academy and say, okay, we need your input, but we don't really know what we're doing. You don't really know what you're doing. Let's try and figure it out together. I feel like that's quite a big ask for a government which operates in the public political sphere. So do you think that's viable, firstly, for politicians? Do they want to take that risk? Do they have the political room for maneuver to take that risk? And secondly, also for scientists, are they willing to engage in that way and engage in give and take, given that they're part of a culture which values independence and free speech and, calling things as they see them based on the evidence rather than on any other external considerations?
Well, I think it is possible, not in all areas. I think it would not work at all in areas where there is a very hot political debate and where things are already in the media and where there's very strong polarization. So I think this would be absolutely worst place to start science advice. But there are some areas which are not so controversial. And which could also have long-term impact, and where policymakers could see the potential positive effect also for themselves, both in the short term, so until the next elections, and also in the longer term, where there could be some more general benefit for the communities they represent or which they want to appeal to. And here, I believe it would be probably sufficient to essentially make space for science advice with clear statement that the government may or may not use it. One thing that I found very useful when working in the group of chief scientific advisors was the scoping process. So actually finding the right question and discussing what the scientific question should be so the answer can be useful for the policymaker is actually more important than giving an answer. The question is the key. This collaboration between policymakers and scientists would have to rely on people courageous enough to enter into the discussion of what the most useful question would be. And if this happens, then I believe that the scientists could organize themselves bottom up or with the help of institutions such as the universities or Polish Academy of Sciences or maybe the learned societies. It depends on the topic. I believe they could find a proper group of experts. Then some piece of advice could be formed, and then the government would be free to use it or ignore it. For scientists, the incentive could be, if the advice is useful, the government or a particular office in the government or a particular minister, for instance, could come back and with another question. And this is how it worked with a group of chief scientific advisors and the commissioners, where we had repeated requests for addressing new problems and formulating new scientific questions, which is, for me, this is evidence that actually that our initial answers, our initial opinions were actually useful. So I think starting this process would be possible if the policymakers could be persuaded to find something that is not in a very hot and polarized debate. Currently, because of many crises and polarization on pretty much every topic, it's more difficult than ever. But it can always get worse. So I don't think why the policymakers and scientists shouldn't start right now rather than wait for some better times.
Yeah, I can see that topics that are in the public eye and kind of politically controversial are maybe not the best places to start when you want to try out a new way of doing science advice. But on the other hand, I think we saw this with COVID, having a desperately urgent and very public need for science advice is a great motivator. I mean, maybe that's the only way we can ever get people all around the table in the first place. Couldn't that be a good place to start for that reason?
Yes, of course, but advice in times of crisis and for the matters of crisis and more long-term advice on policies are quite different from one another. And they have to take into account different issues and obviously the advice on policies that have long impact and would be expected to function for a long time. Then the advice has to take into account the changing the perception of the public opinions. Obviously, if the policy is introduced, there will be opinions about it. This is always a moving target, and the landscape is constantly changing. The scientists may not be able to predict how the landscape would change, but the policymaker has to make this bet.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's the way the cookie crumbles. I'm interested because I wanted to ask you about any peculiarities of Poland. Every country has its unique quirks and elements that need to be taken into account if you're designing a science advice system. And I wondered if you had any insights on that with respect to Poland. So, for instance, I'm not very well informed about the details, but one thing I gather from reading media reports that reach me is that the political debate is quite febrile and the government is fairly conservative. Does that have any implications, for instance, for the public perception or the politicians' perception of science and its value?
Well, I think there is a public debate in Poland on many issues. The debate is mostly driven by conflicts of values and beliefs rather than by views on science. So science in the public debate, unfortunately, is mostly used as ammunition by all the sides of the debate, because very often there are actually not just two sides, but many more in different topics. And well, yes, I agree. The Polish society and the Polish government is somewhat on the conservative side. I mean, definitely, I would not call Poland like the most liberal country in Europe. But we do have a whole spectrum of different attitudes in society, ranging, of course, from hardcore conservatives to extreme liberals. And this can change actually depending on the topic. And there are many different divides in the public debate, and people who are opposing each other in one aspect can be actually get together in another. So I mean, our society is to some extent divided, but it's dynamic, and of course the policy making and the politics, I mean, has to take this divide into account. And unfortunately, usually before the elections, actually the polarization is increased because the politicians are fighting for votes, and usually this works better if actually polarization is increased rather than decreased. However, you mentioned that policymakers in Poland may have not so much trust in science that in other countries. I don't think so. I don't have the data on the trust of Polish politicians in science, but I think if there is mistrust, then there could be a higher mistrust to scientists and scientists' opinions, especially given in public, rather than in science itself. Here, when we still continue discussing about the relation between policy making and politics and science, many scientists have a perception that an advising scientist or scientist who gives advice, especially on TV, is a science advisor. And it's more often than not, this is not an advisory role. It's basically private opinion of someone with a particular professional background. And policymakers are used to scientists sharing their opinion this way, as giving advice but not being advisors. And I think this is one of the reasons why the trust may not be so high as in some other countries, where the scientists also find different channels to communicate with the government than just accepting an invitation to a TV program and giving some advice, the more controversial the better.
Yeah, so discipline needed on all sides, as much from the scientists as from the politicians. It does make sense. So then, well, let's broaden things out. Setting aside that particular issue, are there other specificities of Poland that have implications of any kind for science advice?
Well, no, and actually I think Poland is not that different from other countries, because there is an ecosystem of science advice and scientists having advisory roles. What is missing so far is the body of a chief scientific advisor or a group of chief scientific advisors to the central government at the level of the prime minister, because I think this would make a difference. This is missing. Well, obviously the prime minister has various advisory bodies, but what I'm referring to now is like this general mechanism that could address all scientific questions, especially in long-term advice. But in Poland we do have all the other elements of the system that are typical for mature, technologically advanced countries, including all the sort of advisory committees on technical and regulatory issues. So there are many bodies with experts advising on health, environment, safety, risk assessment, preparation of guidelines, and so on. We do have the science and innovation policy committees, and of course the scientific academies and learned societies have their role. So I mean, most of the elements of the system are already there, and they are working rather well. I mean, I don't think they work less well than in other countries in Western Europe. While some of them may have different impact, may have different roles, like for instance, the Polish Academy of Sciences has its own institutes, which is not the case in many countries in the Western Europe. So this, for instance, this changes the role of the academy. But what I think is really missing and could make a difference is the high-level advisory body at the level of the prime minister that could have a general advisory role covering all fields of research and being composed in such a way to make emphasis on scientific excellence on the one side, data gathering and proper processing on the other side, so having a proper admin organizational support, and then being able to synthesize evidence rather than to make bargains with advocacy coming from different ends that have to be balanced with each other. So if this advocacy is kept under control and the real role of science advice, evidence synthesis is strengthened, then I believe this could have a success.
Excellent. You sound quite optimistic? Do you think there's momentum now to do it? I mean, if I come back in 10 years and ask you, will it all be in place?
I don't know. Predicting future is very difficult, and I don't know whether this will materialize. I'm optimistic that it can be done. So it just takes someone to do it and to keep enough space for experimenting. So to have a sort of a safe space both for policymakers and the scientists to try this communication and to make errors and to learn from these errors. So for that reason, actually, I don't think that this advice would have to be like fully, totally transparent from the very beginning, and especially at the beginning, this should be safe for both sides, so there is no sort of public scrutiny picking on all the mistakes made by the policymakers and the scientists, because that could be a recipe for proving that it cannot work. So I think this sort of safe space for collaboration is absolutely necessary. And of course, in different countries, it must be different. And in Poland, it will have to take into account all the cultural roles, how people behave, how people read each other, emotions, how messages are conveyed, what kind of level of intensity is acceptable, and so on. Because obviously, this differs from one country to another, and this affects the format and the temperature of the advice given. And I believe that professionals in the government and professionals in science who are intelligent people would quickly learn how to make it work if they saw that this is actually good for them.
Yeah. I would like to pick up a bit more on this question of the value of transparency, because I think there are two fairly strongly principled opposing views on this, both of which I've heard on this podcast, actually, from previous eminent guests. And I'm sure there's some nuances in between. So one strong view is transparency is vital. Scientific advice should be given in public and it should be explained to the public. So, well, for all kinds of reasons to do with accountability and democracy, and also more practical things like public understanding and acceptance and so on. So that's one. Then the opposite view is that the integrity of the conversation, possibly the private conversation between the policymaker and the scientist, has to be protected so that these exchanges can be open and honest and two-way, and there's space to genuinely explore things away from the public spotlight and away from the cut and thrust of politics. Would you care to wade into that disagreement? I mean, more than you already indicated?
Well, I think the most important thing in the science advice that it should be fit for purpose. And the purpose can be different depending on the topic, and especially depending on the temperature of the public debate and of the potential consequences, the public perception of risk, the public perception of controversies involved in a given topic. I think this should determine whether a particular advice should be given openly and sort of adding fuel to the fire sometimes, or if it should be kept silent so the decision maker actually can make better decisions without risking public outrage or increasing the polarization, because some of the decisions based on scientific advice could be polarizing. And I don't think that just keeping transparency as the key value is the right way. Transparency, of course, is valuable, but sometimes it can get in the way of making good decisions and having actually beneficial effect for the society.
Yeah, and you can have both sometimes, right?
Of course.
Like you just said, you can have the academy publishing its very open and transparent opinions, and then you can also have a scientist whispering in the politician's ear, to use a deliberately silly image.
Absolutely. I think that both the beauty of science advice is in that it can come with so many different ways, and it can be formatted in different ways, and actually it could be addressed to very different people and organizations, and the language changes the perception of the advice. And this is all about narratives. We perceive the facts only through pre-existing narratives, and obviously different recipients have different narratives, and the different scientific opinions could be interpreted within the different narratives in a very different way. So it's the question of what kind of narratives we want to plug into with the scientific advice. Maybe some of the narratives should be left in peace. So sometimes it is better to limit the range of the interlocutors for discussing certain scientific evidence. It depends on what the purpose is. So the different organizations may have different purpose. Obviously, the Polish Academy of Sciences has different purpose than a specialized body at the ministry or at the office of the prime minister advising the government. So I think there's space for all of this.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's probably as good a place as any to leave our conversation. But I want to thank you very much indeed. You have provided a perspective that's both well-informed and thoughtful, but also very pragmatic. So Professor Janusz Bujnicki, I wish you all the best in your work in Poland and in Brussels. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Toby.
The Science for Policy podcast is produced by SAPEA. We're a consortium of Europe's academy networks, representing more than 100 academies, young academies, and learning societies from more than 40 countries across Europe. We're part of the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism, and as such we're funded by the European Union. Having said that, the opinions on this podcast are those of the guests, and sometimes mine, but they're not the views of SAPEA and certainly not of the European Commission. And finally, this lovely cello music is written by Carlo Alfredo Piatti and performed by Elizaveta Sushchenko. And I'm sorry for talking over it.